But there are also several swords of Damocles that are hanging over our heads here in Africa, including climate change, that could threaten millions of lives. And that is why we have 3 clocks ticking in this room. And one is the doomsday clock of an ecological disaster. Second is we're less than 200 days away from Copenhagen. And third, we got 75 minutes in here, in fact a little bit less, to figure it all out. This is part of a process. This is part of the Global Redesign series. So this is not a one-off. We hope to keep this going under the WEF. And this is on record. But let's try to make it sound as if we're just talking to each other and to you. And I hope there's a lot of participation. Let's make some headlines, I hope. Let's start first with our guests. I'll start from left to right. No, I'll start from right. Ulla Tornes, the Danish Minister for Development. And we don't want to see your party rained on at the end of the year. Buyelwa Patience Sonjika, actually, let me jump to her as well, out of decorum. And she is the Environment Minister for South Africa. We've got Robert Godsell of Eskom. It is the largest, as most of you know, the largest power company on the continent. Tom Boardman of one of the biggest banks. Sorry, I jumped over. Oh, one of the biggest banks at the very end in South Africa. And Marcus Agius, the head of Barclays Bank, one of the biggest banks in the world. This is a great team to talk about how we can get to Copenhagen, how we can try to develop this continent in a low-carbon fashion. Let's start with Sonjika. And some of us know about this Nairobi Declaration about the African countries wanting to get together and show a common front, not only on what their expectations are, and there's a lot of cash involved, but also what they can bring to the table to try to attract not only government funding, but private funding. Sonjika?
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody here. Indeed, I must start by agreeing that climate change is a phenomenon that will affect all humankind, and all of us equally so. We have to be concerned about climate change. But not only that, we need to take action, as we have begun to do that. But maybe let me preface my input by saying the most important thing for us in Africa and South Africa is that the whole society has a responsibility to participate on matters that would help us manage this phenomenon and the disasters that would occur as a consequence of climate change. So awareness for me is very, very important. I've said as my first comment that we need to demystify climate change. Ordinary people must know that there is this phenomenon. What does it mean? How will it impact on me and my life as this ordinary, very poor person? I think that's very important, because you begin then to take the whole nation along with you in terms of ensuring that they participate in this important program.
How do you do that?
Having said that,
how do you do that, Buyelwa? How do you get people personally involved?
You do that by developing policies, strategies, plans that would then ensure this participation. But of course, you can't do that as government without entering into partnerships with other stakeholders. You need civil society, you need business, you need everybody to participate in those programs. But what is important will be strategies that will come from government that will ensure this participation of everybody. That's the first thing. But the impacts of our climate change will affect countries differently because the levels of development are different. If you look at Africa, somebody said one day that Africa, because of its level of development or underdevelopment, is the lung of the world. It is less developed. Indeed, it pollutes less. And the carbon footprint from Africa is less. So the issue then of how we deal and we adapt to climate change as different countries will surely be different. Some countries are more resilient than other countries. And I'm raising this matter because this is the issue that Africa from the Nairobi Declaration has emphasized. Africa has stated clearly that if there is no adaptation, there won't be any Copenhagen. It's in the declaration. And for us, for Africa, we are saying the status accorded to mitigation must be equally accorded to adaptation.
Can you be specific about that at all? Can you give one example?
Repeat? I didn't.
Can you give an example?
Well, the example that I will give is from my immediate experience, where I went to Paris for a meeting, my first meeting, and I found that on the main agenda, adaptation was not included. The debate within that particular formal meeting was to be about mitigation. Of course, there was a slot that was given for the discussion of adaptation in the evening. And indeed, in that evening meeting, there was no discussion. There was just one input from one individual, and the matter ended there.
Can you be specific about adaptation, though? Make one example of adaptation.
Can you be specific about adaptation?
Well, about adaptation, I'm talking about resilience. I'm talking about the ability of countries to manage disasters that would come with climate change. And of course, these abilities differ from one country to another. It's a pity that I don't have enough time because I would illustrate this point. I mean, if you compare what happened in Indonesia, for an example, one of the reasons why there was a tsunami, the impact of the tsunami was as big as it was. It is because there was a problem of early warning systems. That's one of the problems that were there. And for me, that's an indication that the capacity of the country to adapt to the vagaries of climate change was much wanting, if I may put it that way.
Okay. Let's go to Ula. And as development minister, of course, in mind that development and climate change are intricately related. And one of the big questions is where is this money going to come from to help the developing countries in developing in a clean way? And how are you going to keep from your Copenhagen conference from being a bust?
First of all, I would like to thank you so much for inviting me to this very important debate today. And I understand the overall question is, how will we get to Copenhagen? How will we get an ambitious agreement in Copenhagen? I would like to put it. I can assure you that the Danish government, we are trying to do our utmost to make sure that the negotiations is going on, and we will really, we are actually right now putting all our strength into the negotiations work and the preparation for the meeting, because it is very, very necessary. It's absolutely key that the world stick together and that we manage to come up with an ambitious agreement in Copenhagen in December. And why is it so important? We all know, and we just heard from my colleague minister from South Africa, that the issue of climate change is a global issue, and therefore it also needs global solutions. And the question that you asked to me, where should all the money come from? I'm very happy that it's not only government representatives sitting here, we also have private business with us, because global solutions means that all stakeholders need to be involved. We need private business. We need, of course, also civil society in the negotiations and in the awareness of how we actually do this. So we need all kinds of stakeholders involved in the process. But when it comes to financing, we of course need also private business. And I really hope that in Copenhagen we will manage to agree on how we can involve private business in making sure that the transfer of technology in terms of energy and energy solutions and so on, that we manage to set up an agreement where we also manage to involve private business. I can say on behalf of what we are actually doing from the Danish side in development. We have, for a couple of years, already dealt with development and climate change because these things are interlinked. And I agree with my South African colleague that when it comes to developing countries, it is mainly adaptation that is the key. So we have actually been working with adaptation for quite some while. And I can give you a concrete example. and that's in relation to when there is a shift of rainfall, for example. I mean, these are very practical, down-to-earth examples. But when there is a shift of rainfalls, like, for example, in Tanzania, where the Maasai people, they are absolutely dependent on natural resources like agriculture, and when there is a shift of rainfall, I mean, they need to change the seasons when they are harvesting and so on and so forth, but they might also need other seeds and all these things to reach that or to find solutions on this. They need some knowledge and research, and we can support them with these kinds of information on what would be interesting for them to make sure that they can increase their yields or that they can keep their yields and that so they can, I mean, survive and continue living the life that they would like to. So this is a very concrete, basic, down-to-earth example of where we, with development assistance, can assist people in adapting to climate change. I could give you a handful of other concrete examples during the debate.
Something concrete about that.
Yeah.
That's great. Let's go to Marcus because Ulla's looking for money from you to seal this deal. But you also have expectations about what should be done. You have things what you would like to do in terms of adaptation, in terms of fixing the structural vulnerabilities that exist in Africa. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, let me, if I may, make a couple of general comments, first of all, about banking as such, and then put it into context. I don't have to tell anyone in this room that the banking industry has been through a profound crisis in the last 12 to 18 months, and it's not through it yet, but it is coming through it. And I'm not going to debate here the causes of the banking crisis, but there were a couple that are relevant, and one of the most relevant is that risk was underpriced. Money was being made available for projects on a basis which actually proved not to be sustainable. It was wrongly priced. And
can you be specific about that? One example?
Yes, lots of money was made available at prices that just simply didn't make sense. And when the assumptions were made that the good times would last forever, and they didn't, and that we saw. And then when the good times turned into bad times, the prices collapsed, and what was thought to be a good asset turned into a toxic asset. But let's not get into that. The more general point I'm trying to make is that what has happened and what is happening is two things, and both of which are fundamental to this conversation. First of all, risk everywhere is being repriced. That doesn't mean to say it's being overpriced, it's being correctly priced. A lot of customers have come and said that, the terms under which we can borrow money from you has gone up. Why is that? We're the same old company. The answer is we were probably charging you too little beforehand, believe it or not. And secondly, because of the state of the world, your inherent risk has gone up, so we need to price it correctly. That's the first point. The second point is that because so much value has been destroyed in the banking crisis, there needs to be, and it has been happening, a substantial recapitalization of the banking industry around the world. And that is happening in real time, big time. And that process will come to an end. And banks will eventually be in a position where they are adequately capitalized. And what that means is that that's the time when we return to business as normal. We've been through a period when business has been completely abnormal for obvious reasons. And what that means is that as any bank, and our bank is no exception, looks to the future, we need to find places going forward where we can do successful business. And one obvious area here is the whole subject of climate change. So what we are hungry for, like any other bank, is ways in which to diversify our sources of income. A good example, since you're always hot on specifics, is emissions trading, an activity we simply didn't engage in a few years ago. Now we do it in very substantial volumes, and that is very much helping the climate change debate. But there are other ways in which we will look to invest money, and what we therefore need are projects coming out of Africa, coming out of the rest of the world, which the banking industry can support. And my point is that for the right projects which are properly structured and where they can be properly priced in terms of risk, the capital will be there. The capital will be there.
Okay, and then let's go to Bob over at Eskom. It sounds like you got a tough customer over there who's going to really demand that the risk be correctly priced. That means your loans are going to be more expensive, probably. You're in a cash squeeze right now. You're trying to raise the rates by about a third. You're also trying to get money to build more plants so we don't have so many blackouts here anymore. How are you going to do this and do it in a clean way?
Look, again, just allow me a minute just to join very briefly the debate about Copenhagen and what we should hope for. In a way, let me start negatively. I hope we can avoid two very unhelpful dichotomies. Firstly, should we have development or should we mitigate climate change posed as alternatives? This is hopeless. I mean, I hope that Denmark and Britain and the United States understand that if they had faced this choice 50 or 100 years ago, they would always have chosen development. And I hope that people understand that if the choice is posed that way, the conversation will go nowhere. The second is to support the minister. You know, the second, which is scientists have enforced on us, it seems to me, a debate about whether we should concentrate on mitigating climate change or whether we should concentrate on adaptation, when in fact we have to do both. And they're intimately connected. Moving from there, you know, business people, I think, are by nature optimistic, often more optimistic than scientists and politicians. And we need to rescue the future in this miserable debate. The two very powerful forces are technology. And, you know, technology is out there in every form of energy production, including coal. There are dramatic improvements in technology. Clean coal technology actually, in fact, could accommodate the Kyoto protocols in terms of achieving the kinds of reduction that are called for if they had been universally applied. So what we need is new technology and the promotion of new technology. We also then need new market rules for new markets. So, I mean, to echo Marcus, you know, when you underprice something, bad things happen. If you underprice energy, the lights go off. If you underprice risk, you go into chapter 11. And, you know, then what I would be looking for are international interventions, perhaps along the lines of a new Bretton Woods, that facilitate both basic science and also taking to scale new climate-friendly technology so that the future development can be less carbon and less greenhouse gas intensive.
Okay. Let's go on to Tom, who we talked yesterday about concrete examples of how you can attack this as a bank. And you've invested in rainforests. Why?
Well, I think just to, again, digress for a moment, Marcus spoke about the extent of the financial crisis that's hit the world, and I think we've all read about it. I think one of the most powerful lessons that the world has got to take out of this financial crisis is the lessons that we should be applying to climate change. So number one, early warning signals were ignored. particularly those coming from academia. Business just said, nope, it's not going to happen. If you trawl backwards now and you look at what was written back in 2004, 5, and 6 about subprime and about the risks to the global financial system, it was all there. Number two, when the crisis hits, the severity of the crisis is underestimated. And the immediate reaction is self-serving, individual companies individually trying to row their own boat and keep themselves out of trouble when the reaction should have been collective. And in the case of both the financial crisis and climate change, it's got to be global. And finally, I think the lesson is that when something is as large as climate change, you can't do things incrementally. You actually have got to address it, and you've got to throw every resource at it from every angle. So the rainforests are, picking up from Bobby's point, we've got to use new technology, absolutely. But we all know new technology takes time to come on stream, and it's costly, and not everyone can afford it. And by the way, the impact of climate change on Africa, because of its geography and because of its lack of adaptive capacity. Specifically, we run out of water, we can't just go and put massive desalination plants in. We don't have the capacity. We can't pipe water across the continent. We don't have the capacity. So that adaptive capacity is very, very important. So while we are bringing on stream the new technology that Bobby referred to, there's a very simple solution staring us in the face, which is can be a major contributor to slowing climate change, and that is preserving the rainforests. And there are a whole lot of very good reasons why preserving the rainforests is so crucial, and why, in terms of return on investment, it's one of the best returns on investment that the globe can make. Now, we don't have rainforests down here in South Africa, so people say, well, okay, so Tom, why has your bank got involved in rainforest projects, which are all in the sort of 11 Central African countries insofar as Africa goes? Very simply, the devastation of climate change on this continent, because of the geography and lack of adaptive capacity, is massive. Water, food production and food security, ecosystems, disease. Those are just 4 of the 5 or 6 big ones. But you get to water. Right now, without any climate change, a number of African countries are going to run out of capacity in their economically usable land-based water. By 2025, you're going to start hitting a crisis, and that's just around the corner. Already, there are over 200 million, you spoke about millions, there are already 200 million people in Africa who suffer from what is scientifically known as severe water stress. On the ground, that's life and death, potable water, dysentery, disease, people dying unnecessarily.
That's another panel later today, water. But if we can stick with what's in it for you in investing in a rainforest, and how can that maybe work into a Copenhagen agreement?
Well, I think the big thing is it's going to take time for any of the big global initiatives to impact and hit on the ground. So carbon trading, which is a route we've got to go, transferring money from the producers of carbon to the people who are actually storing and saving and reducing carbon. And so we believe that it's up to the private sector in the interim to work to try and raise funds for immediate application. We don't think the big application, the global applications, are going to hit until 2020. We can't afford to lose that decade. And so there is a self-interest from the banking sector, because it is a product that I think is viable, but it is an absolute global necessity that we do it.
Okay. I'd like to open this up to the audience as soon as we can. If there are any questions, if anybody would like to make a contribution, please let me know. I'd like to get a conversation going on here. Ulla, from what you're hearing, does that give you any hope about Copenhagen and the measures the concrete measures that, for instance, in rainforests and the adaptation that Tom was talking about, that Marcus was talking about, does that give you any hope that maybe an agreement can be reached?
But both the issue of rainforest and of course also the issue of adaptation as well as mitigation, because I agree with what you were saying about the linkage between mitigation and adaptation are, part of the negotiations that are going on right now. So I don't know what it will all end up with, but these are issues that are discussed, and what I hear from the panel is that we all agree that we need to agree in Copenhagen, and that is of course the first step, so to say. But what I think is absolutely key when we come to Copenhagen, that is the political will. We need a huge portion of political will, unless we will not manage to agree in Copenhagen. Because we all know what are the consequences if we do not agree. So Nicholas Stern is repeating again and again, it will just be more expensive for all of us if we are not making decisions and actions right now. So we all know the different figures, we all know what will be the consequences if we are not ready to act now. So what is, absolutely key is that the political will be in Copenhagen in December. Rainforest, yes. As development minister, we're also working in different projects with rainforest, and we're of course also supporting different funds, like in the World Bank and the UN, to make sure that this issue is also high on the political agenda, and I'm sure it will be high on the political agenda when we meet in Copenhagen. No doubt about this.
Okay. Yes, Marcus.
If I could make a point really in support of that, given the enormous stakes for the globe coming out of Copenhagen, we obviously all very, very much want an accord to be reached. That's only going to be possible if an awful lot of people make decisions collectively and end up in the right place. And how can that be procured? And thinking about the plenaries that happened last night, there was an amusing exchange at one point when Klaus Schwab said, who do we look to now? Do we look to governments or do we look to business? And what was amusing, he asked the question of the gentleman from the Middle East who said, we have monarchies. So it wasn't a question of government or business. But the point was a more serious one, which is, who's in charge here? Who has to take the lead? And referring back to an experience I had earlier when I sat on a committee set up by the CBI, the Federation of British Industry in the UK, to work out what the reaction or response of business should be to the climate change challenge. One of the key conclusions we came out of, which may sound oversimplistic, is that we're all responsible. In other words, you can't look to government to fix it. It's too big. You can't look to business to fix it. They absolutely have equity in it. You also have to look to the consumer. And the ideal solution is a sort of virtuous cycle whereby the consumer, both as a voter and as a buyer of products, puts pressure on business, which in turn puts pressure on government for regulation, which in turn educates the population, and so it goes round. But to say it's for you to fix, it's not going to work. We're in this together.
First, I'm sorry, Ulla, you wanted to say something, but who's in charge? Who's in charge?
We're all in charge. That was what I meant by saying that we need global solutions. We cannot just say it's just governments who has to find the solutions. We have to set the rules and the regulations, of course, but we need business, we need civil society, we need consumers. Yeah, you're very right. We need also, I think, to have a change of mindset globally when it comes to how we actually react as individuals. And can I just tell you about what we have experienced in Denmark in relation to the consumption of energy? And I really think that we have a good example to show, because since the beginning of the 1980s, we have had, and until now, we have had an increase in our economy of approximately 75% without having an increase in our consumption of energy. And how come? We have really, worked a lot with the consumption of energy and saving of energy from the individual to the huge industries, and that is due to, I think, a change of mindset that was actually caused by a huge energy crisis that was in the beginning of the 70s. So a change of mindset from the consumers and all individuals is of course also needed. So we are all responsible. Of course, some are having more responsibility than others to make sure that we reach the agreement, but we are all responsible.
Brielle, before you,
Well-
I know you want to talk. I know you want to talk. But first, I mean, one of the concrete examples that have been from South Africa, actually, you tore a page out of Denmark's book and Germany's book on guaranteed return for alternative energy. Could that be broadened in Africa as an example of something that could maybe push ahead toward Copenhagen?
I didn't hear your question very well. But if you're making reference to the renewable energy, wind energy, and all of that, surely it can be brought into Africa, and there is great potential, especially for hydropower in Africa. You know, the biggest challenge that we have for that potential is that we are unable at this point to access credits from the CDM program. And I think it's just too onerous for small players. And something needs to be done. A review of the criterion used for us to access credits needs to be done. But the point that I wanted really to come into is the issue that we are in this, all of us together. But surely somebody has to take the lead. And I think in this instance, government has a responsibility to take the lead and create an enabling environment for all the players. I think it's important. Through its policies, through its strategies, through its legislation, that enabling environment must be created. But also that should be translated into programs that will then bring everybody on board, because as we all say, we are in this together as the humankind.
Is that what you'd like to see in the Nairobi, after the Nairobi Declaration, this common front from Africa?
Well, definitely, that's what we'd want to see as Africa. But more importantly, Africa would want to see an outcome that is inclusive, that is fair, you know, for all of us, and that will be effective.
What is inclusive and what is fair to you?
Well, inclusive would bring the balance between adaptation and mitigation, but also the development imperatives must be balanced with climate imperative. You can't divorce the two. You can't divorce the two, so it's important for us that balance should come across.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bob, let me, I'll ask you about, here's another example is Norway would like to see a cut from emissions trading used for battling climate change, getting you some money. And Marcus was talking about that too, well, about emissions trading as a good way to go about it. Norway is saying, let's take a cut from that and try to fund cleaner energy. What do you think?
Well, look, speaking from Eskom's point of view, money is always welcome. I mean, we do have to note that a large part of the developed world is in Chapter 11. So money is a bit short. Now, what I'm more interested in is, you know, what I would really love out of Copenhagen is a kind of second Bretton Woods. This was a rare moment in which international diplomacy really worked. And what it enabled was a degree of financial stability. It enabled the emergence of financial global capital markets. So we want to look at the promotion of technology, the rolling out to scale of sensible new technologies in energy and water, in infrastructure generally. You know, if we could have an enabling institution like a kind of new IMF that would actually change the rules of the marketplace. I would stress marketplace rules here because I think our public utilities are regulated around the world in often a very clumsy way. And what we need is the move from fixed line telephony to mobile telephony in understanding that there's a brand new market out there. Many of the new technologies lend themselves to small scale generation and local distribution in the case of energy. So it really would, you know, the help I would be looking for is not massive infusions of money into Africa. You know, that's whistling in the sky. Anyway, you know, Asia is the place where money is now accumulated. And Asia doesn't seem to be in the habit of handing out very large donor aid. I would be looking for enabling technologies, taking good new technologies to scale, boosting infrastructure in Africa, which is a win-win for business and in the north and in the south.
What's your opinion about carbon capture and storage. How much, is that the silver bullet, you think?
Look, it's one of the areas, absolutely. And, you know, I would just go back to what Marcus said. Let's price public damage realistically.
Right.
It's not only in regard to carbon, by the way. There are a number of other areas in which environmental degradation can be publicly priced and publicly discouraged. That's the kind of rules that but yes, there is a lot of opportunity. I would stress also that it's not really a choice between coal versus everything else. We need all of these new technologies. They equally have a place. I would again stress that the clean coal technologies hold great promise for a lot of countries that in 50 years' time are still going to be using a lot of coal to generate energy.
But CCS is not entirely proven yet, and the price is not yet entirely proven. It's still kind of out, the jury's out. Europe seems to be stressing it. Marcus, is that something you'd invest in?
Clean coal? My understanding on clean coal and carbon capture is that the technology substantially exists. I mean, obviously it can be improved, but it's not, is this something which could work? Yes, we know it could work. And there are people who are utilizing it. I was talking to a major oil company the other day, and they've got a big installation going up on the west coast of America. The problem is that it's expensive.
Yeah.
It does the trick.
Is the risk worked into the price?
And you know, I think if you want to talk about energy production going forward, you're going to have a complete mixture of different sources of energy. But you know, if the world has enormous supplies of certain types of energy, whether it's gas or whether it's coal, we have to find ways of exploiting that. And you know, the price at the end of the day may have to take the strain.
And what about the small is beautiful aspect that you suggested about smaller energy production projects? Is that something a bank as yours would be interested in as well? Or is that up to World Bank, IMF?
No. These things depend, as I say, on the economics. I mean, I just going to make a very, very straightforward point. You know, banks are not in the charity business. They never were, and nor should they be. Yeah. But they're there as enablers. And I think the contribution we have to make and the contribution we should make is capital, where capital can be used well, and secondly is innovation. You know, so we have to find new ways of getting capital to do what capital is meant to do. I mean, we've talked about a couple today. One was emissions trading. The other one is the rainforest. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, the thought that something could be more valuable by being left untouched than it could be by being cut down and exploited is a very novel concept, but it works. It works, and that's what financiers are there to do. They're there to try and find out how to do these things.
Please, if there's anybody who would like to add something to this, and also, if you think we've covered the right points, maybe we're missing something here. Maybe you've got the key for Copenhagen. Maybe somebody does. But let me ask Tom. Continuing along that line, I mean, what other measures do you think could be brought to the table in Copenhagen to cut carbon output? Small is beautiful. Is that one way to go after it? Carbon capture. How could we do this?
So just on the small is beautiful, I think that's absolutely correct, and that's where governments need to legislate to make it possible for co-production of energy. We as a bank have been involved in projects right through Africa as far afield as Mali in pretty small energy generation projects. Increasingly, you know, banks are absolutely, you know, 90% of the money that we lend out is our depositors' money. We have a huge responsibility. So we can't just price things sub-economically. So minimum returns on viable projects, I think, is something that governments should definitely be looking at. Being very careful of the laws of unintended consequences, because we've seen what happens when you try and subsidize houses and make it things affordable for people who can't afford them. So I think there's a huge amount, but I can't not use this opportunity to get back on my hobby horse of the rainforests. Rainforest degradation being chopped down and burnt, not harvested, chopped down and burnt to make way for agriculture, particularly soya, palm oil, and cattle grazing. The burning of those forests is now the second biggest generator of CO2 on the planet, after the energy industry.
Most people don't know that.
More than all the transport industry on the globe, more than every aeroplane, train, bus, and ship. Burning forests that don't need to be burnt is the second biggest, 17% of total carbon emissions. You just got to stop that, and you buy a whole lot of time to bring on stream all the other things. And it's doable, but it requires, and it's not the money. It requires more than anything, political will.
Okay.
Well, I would
please,
agree
Gabrielle,
with Tom on the issue of forests and afforestation, reforestation, as well as planting of trees. I think it's very important. And it's always, the impact of it is always underestimated. I mean, flying over, if I may be anecdotal a bit, flying over into Mthatha, when I looked at the dongas that are beginning to open there, they are huge. That's rural, and if you were to begin to take the program of planting trees into that area, you also make an impact on the livelihood of the people of the rural areas, creating jobs. You actually give them what they are used to doing. It's not like you're going to develop a skill. That's the first thing. The second one is on technology. I would really also want us not to necessarily confine ourselves to investing in development or transfer only. I think research and development of technology is also necessary. South Africa has just launched a center of excellence for research and development for carbon capture storage technology. And I think that this is really another area that investors should be looking at. Because, I mean, we have an abundance of reserves of coal. What do we do with that? Do we just abandon the coal when we are a developing economy? It's not that easy. But at the same time, we have to be mindful of the fact that coal is a fossil and it creates the problem of emissions. So we are mindful that we have to reduce our carbon print, but at the same time, we are still dependent on coal. That's a reality, but we need to make efforts to ensure that there's technology that mitigates.
And can you guarantee, Buyel, there's this talk about the desire for political will among our two bankers. They would like to see political will. Can you deliver that? Can you deliver that political will, do you think?
Well, Africa has delivered political will. I can say that without fear of contradiction. Africa is committed to doing its best to participate in the program of climate change. The declaration speaks for itself, but it's not the absence of that political will. It's the capacity that is a problem. To what extent or what kind of capacity does Africa have to deal or to participate optimally in this debate? That's the biggest issue.
Okay, before we go to our questions, Tom, I'm sorry, Bob, you got a question? You got a?
Yeah, just this thing about Africa and the capacity. I think one of the crucial things to understand on my hobby horse is that when it comes to the rainforests, this is not Africa holding out its hands to the rest of the world and saying, please give us some money. Africa owns one of the most scarce resources on the planet. Now, apart from what goes into the atmosphere, when the trees, through photosynthesis, actually absorb carbon, our last lung that actually does the respiration and then stores it, you chop that out, you're getting a double whammy. You're losing the photosynthesis and the carbon storage, and then you're releasing it into the atmosphere. So all that Africa is saying to the world is, we own this resource, and to live and to develop, we're going to have to chop it down, unless you can find a way to pay us an alternative pricing mechanism to keep it alive. This is not a begging bowl. This is pure commerce.
Good. We've got a question from the audience.
Sorry if I come in now, but there's also the issue of logging,
Yes.
which really needs to be looked at. The Congo Basin is getting depleted because of logging by big players. And I think we can't leave that out of this discussion. It's very important.
Well, before we go, you want to make, very briefly.
Very briefly, we were talking about political will, and this is of course absolutely key that there will be political will when we meet in Copenhagen, and therefore we have from the Danish government side supported different African negotiations teams as part of our development assistance, because it's of course absolutely necessary that the voice of Africa is being heard during the negotiations. So we have been very happy to support developing countries' participation in the negotiation process, because this is, of course, very necessary, and I'm very happy that this declaration was adopted by the Ministers of Environment in Nairobi just recently as part of the African preparation for the meeting in Copenhagen.
And let's get some voices from the audience as well. Could you please identify yourself?
Yes, Robert Blackburn from SNC-Lavalin, a Canadian engineering company. It strikes me that one of the useful things that could come out of Copenhagen would be some sort of a real commitment, a program, a fund to share technology development. Developing new technology, I don't know, I'm not, in North America, I don't think we're as convinced of the carbon capture being a good economic response at this stage, but there are other technologies. We haven't talked at all about nuclear here. Here's an available technology. It has political drawbacks to it sometimes. In Africa, fantastic hydro resources to be developed. I mean, there are some obvious things that can be done with existing technology, but you know, it's interesting. Arnold Schwarzenegger was in Toronto 2 or 3 years ago, and he said, you know, remember back in the 60s and 70s, the billions and billions of dollars we were putting into IT? Well, now we're putting that same amount of investment into environmental research. So go green or hasta la vista, baby. It's his kind of message.
Yeah, maybe you need the Terminator there.
But somehow setting targets is good. But I think that we need to use and find ways to deploy technologies that we already have and work like the dickens with countries like China and India who are multiplying their coal-based generation very quickly to get that technology out there. And you run across intellectual property problems, you have all sorts of issues, but I think you need to solve those and really focus on those, not just from time to time when you get together in Copenhagen or Tokyo, but as an ongoing commitment. So, I don't know who by, but by some international global push.
Thank you, Robert. Maybe that push can come in Copenhagen. Next voice, please. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Rashid Tofi. My day job is the chief executive of this convention center, so welcome to all of you. But my passion is really the environment. I wanted to make an analogy with the technology. What Africa's done with technology in terms of mobile telephony is it took a big mindset shift and said there's no time for putting in fixed line infrastructure, and we've shown as Africa and other developing countries in Malaysia and Indonesia that you can sort of there are households who never had a fixed line who leapfrogged that and now have a mobile telephone and they're moving straight ahead. I think in the same way. Just a comment to you, Bobby, is that we need to think similarly about energy generation. I mean, we need to say, how long is it going to take us to think traditionally and put in infrastructure for electricity? We should be focusing on the renewable energy sources that are like a mobile telephone, happen at the source. Because 90% of Eskom's generation actually gets lost through transmission. You produce 1 megawatt, and I get 1/10 of a megawatt down here in Cape Town. So we continue to have the mindset of put in the infrastructure, create more energy for people, and then ship it across the country and lose 90% in transmission. Whereas we should be thinking out of the box like people did with mobile telephony and investing our money and our time and resource in energy generation, renewable energy generation, but at the point of usage.
How much are you focusing on that, Bob?
If I could respond, I mean, I emphatically agree. Look, I don't know about the 90%, and I must say in Cape Town, you're lucky you get anything at all, actually. Anyway, concretely, if we could get every household that has a geyser to have a solar geyser, we would save one large power station of coal-fired energy, more than 10% of the total grid, okay? And if you think about that in terms of its carbon footprint, if you think about that in terms of its capital cost, that's plus 100 billion rands. In doing this, we would stimulate a local industry. These technologies are absolutely developed. And indeed, the South African solar water heaters are frost resistant, which the Australians and Chinese that we import generally aren't. So, you could be talking about creating tens of thousands of jobs, and it's a win-win for everyone, and that's one example. There's another example, because we haven't yet talked about that. Transmission is an issue. I mean, Eskom runs about 360,000 kilometers of high-voltage transmission lines. Almost all of the generation happens in Mpumalanga, a small part of Mpumalanga. If we expanded nuclear and put these on the coast, then we would have a dispersed transmission system, and this would be in many ways more efficient. In biomass, other solar and wind, there are opportunities for local generation and local distribution, and that's the way we should be thinking. I mean, having said all of that, coal is going to continue to play a role, and so underground coal gasification and carbon capture technologies are absolutely critical to the country's future.
Okay, Bob made his sales pitch. Tom, Marcus, are you ready to invest?
Sure. My answer is unchanged. The point that Bobby makes and the point that the gentleman from the floor makes is absolutely right. Let's take the idea of this geyser, for example. It's a small thing. What's going to make that a reality? It's going to make technology. We've got the technology. It's going to need government regulation to make it required that people do this. Every new house has to have one of these things, and it's going to require consumer finance to make it financeable, because the electricity saved is going to finance the cost of the capital. This is a very small but very good example of what can be done if you get those three components right. And in that three components, we had the consumer, we had the company, the business, and we had the government.
Ula, you wanted to say something?
Seen from a development perspective, access to energy is of course absolutely key when it comes to poverty reduction and reaching the Millennium Development Goals. And I mean, when talking about Africa, one just have to look outside the window, if there is a window, and one can see the renewable resources like solar, wind, hydropower has been mentioned several times, but also biomass. There is a huge potential in the use of biomass on the African continent. But to be honest, there is a huge difference between South Africa and probably the rest of Africa. And talking about transmission and the grid and so on and so forth, I mean, this is relevant for countries like Africa, but when it comes to a remote village in Tanzania or elsewhere, I mean, this is not what is discussed. What is discussed is exactly how can we make a decentralized system by use of renewable energy resources like solar or wind power and also biomass. I really think that we have to look into this, and there we need technology and transfer of technology. And I'm very happy to learn that the banking people are ready to invest in this, because this is where I really believe there is a huge potential for access to energy in many parts of Africa.
We have a voice. Oh, I'm sorry. We have two voices. Go ahead.
Neil Clutie, the Avenge Group. Mr. Boardman, just one thing I thought was missing from your very good analogy between the global recession and climate change was greed. And I think that played a massive role in the recession that we're in, and it's playing a massive role in the situation we're in with climate change and the greed of countries to strip resources without thinking about the consequence. So I think you should add that on. Secondly, I think business has got lots of lessons that have been learnt in the past that can be applied to climate change and to Kyoto. This is a process about change management, and there are strong change management principles that can be applied. There has to be a compelling story, and no doubt there is one. The fact of the matter is that compelling story has to reach out to the world. It can't be a compelling story only for the people in this room. Secondly, there's role modeling. And it's all very well for us to stand up and talk about climate change and the impact of it, and then get out of this room into our V8s or our private jets or go to our golf estate at Pinnacle Point. And we need to be role models for climate change, all of us. I think we've covered the issues with systems and the political will And that clearly is also a strong factor. And then last but not least, the teachings and learnings and the capability and the capacity of our civilization to change and to understand it really has to get out there. The initiatives of Earth Hour, for example, was such a small thing that started 2 years ago that has grown to a global phenomenon in 2 years. Is incredible, and those are the kind of initiatives that we need to push. And good luck with Kyoto.
Thank you, sir. Another voice, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay, my name is Rishon Chimboza, and I'm with Africa Practice.
Sorry, where are you? I don't see. Okay.
Yeah.
Could you stand up?
Yeah, I am standing up.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, gosh, it's in the shadows. Turn up the lights. That's all right. Sorry about that. Okay. Why don't you sit up here?
All right, my name is Rishon Chimboza, and I'm with Africa Practice, which is a communications and PR company. My question is directed towards Ms. Sonjika, and it's on carbon finance. One of the objectives of the Clean Development Mechanism is technology transfer from the developed countries to the developing countries. And Africa has been missing out on this. And Africa only has 3% share of the carbon market. And most of the money has been going to the BRIC countries. So have you toyed with the idea of introducing a Tobin tax, perhaps, on the income which is derived from carbon trading, and then developing a fund from this Tobin tax, which will feed into the Bretton Woods institution, which Mr. Godsell suggested, and then clean energy developers from developing countries can then draw down from this fund? When you're going into Copenhagen, are you going to be looking at this? Because it's highly likely that with the way things are and the energy intensity of most African economies, we are not going to get anything from carbon trading, and we're not going to get much money to fund our clean energy initiatives. So unless this path is taken, I don't think much will happen. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, anything that will make the CDM program accessible to Africa will be looked into. I think that can constitute part of the debate that needs to be engaged on or opened on the CDMs. Otherwise, they remain not very meaningful and helpful for Africa. Unfortunately, I interacted with Africa for the first time on the 29th. So we flagged this matter, but we have not yet begun the debate. But I think it's an issue that we could look at, but surely there would be a number of options that we would be looking at. The concern came from a country, Mozambique, as a country that has a hydropower project, Cahora Bassa. When they tried to access credits for Cahora Bassa, they could not get anything because they were told that it doesn't qualify. Now, this is where I came from when I made the point that I made. But developing a fund, I don't think it would be a bad idea, but it would depend as to whether Africa sees that as the answer to the issue of credits and the CDMs.
Yes, sir.
Michael Spicer, Business Leadership South Africa. I just wanted to re-emphasize a point which Bobby and Marcus made earlier, because it's relevant to the mini debate they had a couple of minutes ago, but also to the recent comments. Unless we price energy according to the various costs involved, we will not develop these alternate industries, whether it is solar power or the various other. South Africans, and I'm sure many other Africans, insist on having cheap energy with somebody else footing the bill. And in that environment, you will not get the energy you require, whether it is from traditional or indeed new alternatives. This is a central imperative, and we have to face up to it. There is no alternative.
But what about that political? Let me ask you. What about the political sensitivity of this? Raising rates by a third among a population that just elected a president who could see his honeymoon cut short because of that.
Sure. Well, the alternative is to have cheap, no electricity.
And more blackouts.
And more blackouts.
Yeah,
so
right.
Take your choice.
What do you say to that?
No, I mean, Eskom's slogan last year is we have the cheapest electricity in the world. Unfortunately, we're out of stock at the moment. That's your choice.
No electricity free.
Right.
Can we?
Sorry. Yes.
Over on this side of the room, please.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Sorry. Thank you. I'm Shisano from Mozambique. I heard nothing about the relationship of agriculture in Africa with the all climate change. I heard about the bushfires, but bushfires are normally in many countries a consequence of poor technologies in agriculture. And the peasants put fire in the bush involuntarily, and that is the process which they have to cultivate. The second is about meat. Much of bushfires come when the hunters come and try to catch game. Now, I don't know whether in Copenhagen you are going to discuss this relationship between agriculture, how to enhance agriculture. Because people have, in other words, between climate change and food, it will be this relationship looked at, because people have to eat, they have to cut trees, they have to burn so that they clean areas to cultivate, and so on. So this was my question. Thank you.
Well, the UK and Norway, thank you, sir. The UK and Norway, I understand, have projects in the Congo rewarding those who do not deforestate. And perhaps that could be expanded. Ulla, you wanted to say something.
But of course, agriculture is a huge part of the whole thing. I mean, one of the reasons why we are discussing these things is because climate change is really affecting people, and we know that the people in the poorest countries are the most vulnerable to climate change, and they are the most vulnerable because they are the people most depending on nature. And this is why, I mean, we have not explicitly mentioned agriculture, but agriculture is of course a big part of it, because people in the developing world is depending on nature, and when there is a change of climate, we have of course to adapt to this change of climate, and this we are working a lot with when it comes to development assistance. How can we make sure that the projects we are working with, that they take into account the changes of climate change that we already know, to make sure that adaptation is taken into account. So yes, we are of course dealing with the issue of agriculture.
Okay. I'm sorry, Bielwa. Yes.
Indeed, Mr. President, it is an important matter, especially for Africa. And you have actually spoken to the crux of the matter when it comes to adaptation. Adaptation for Africa would also be about management of vegetation and teaching or educating our people to look at new ways of managing vegetation. And in doing so, again, you create opportunities for them because more of those people would be in less developed areas, rural areas in our own situations. Again, we will be talking about adaptive farming practices, where we would be looking at crop productivity, multi-cropping, and all of those things, but also monitoring the weather. But for me, the debate of demystifying, the issue of demystifying climate change is also about that. Yeah. Because, I mean, these things will go to waste in the eyes of the people if they do not know why and what they should do in helping, in mitigating against climate change. So I'm saying all of those are important, especially for us in Africa, for the very reason that you have spoken to, the issue of food security. It's very important that those matters are discussed, and indeed they are on the agenda.
Our clock's running down. We could take a couple more questions. I think we have a gentleman over here. Sorry. Oh, excuse me,
My name is Namsa Daniels, and I'm with the New Faces and Voices Network. You've talked about the importance of political and also for preparing for Copenhagen, but as African countries, are we really doing enough to promote sustainable development, especially among the most vulnerable segments of the population? For example, if you look at women, women in Africa will face a disproportionate impact from climate change because they're involved in agricultural production. Are we providing women who have no access to electricity? You mentioned the remote, people in remote villages. those people could benefit from new technologies. And the technologies are out there, but are we making it accessible to those women? And are we providing alternative financing mechanisms to enable them to make use of technologies that can address their energy needs?
Let's go to another question. The clock's running down. At least we can raise the questions from the audience. Who's next?
Hi, my name is Charles Hall from the Africa Carbon Livelihoods Trust. What we do is to link rural communities in Africa to the carbon markets. That's the whole idea. And the minister had mentioned earlier the complexity of the clean development mechanism as a problem. I think the real problem for Africa with respect to the world carbon markets is that forestry-related projects and land use have been excluded from the Kyoto Protocol. That's why only 3% of the CDM and compliance market has been accessed by Africa. At Copenhagen, it is absolutely necessary for Africa to demand that forestry-related projects and land use and avoided deforestation be included in the carbon markets. Without doing that, there's nothing that anybody can do to give Africa its fair share of the carbon markets.
Anyone else?
Well.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Mwendia from National Oil Corporation of Kenya. Perhaps as we think of the solutions to be discussed in Copenhagen, including what has been mentioned about how does the CDM finance actually reach the people who can promote the afforestation and the conservation of forests. And also, as we go looking for the political will, we need to also appreciate that politicians are also trying to struggle with the problem of how do we stop people from destroying the forests because they lose votes, like someone has just said in a short time before. So is there a way of also coming up with a sort of a sanction system where just like we know if we score poorly in democracy, then we are not very friendly to the other people across the world. And then we have a sort of a score of if we are destroying environment, we are also losing our good friends out there. Because when I look at what's happening in Kenya, for example, one of the forests we are destroying is a huge catchment that serves on one side the famous Masai Mara National Reserve, and on one side it's serving the Lake Victoria. And if the Lake Victoria water levels are going down, we know what we are doing to the River Nile, and that will affect the whole of Africa. So it's sort of a double-edged sword here, because on one side we are destroying livelihoods of people, and on the other side we are reducing the carbon sink. Now, how do we come up with an incentive program if this is being conserved, but also a sanction system if it's continuing to be destroyed? Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or statements? Okay. Our clock is running down. We're down to 2 minutes. And is there any burning desire to make a statement before the end of this? We don't need to make full statements. If there's somebody who would like to add anything. Ulla, how close are we in Copenhagen? Are you, even though Bonn seemed to bomb the last few days, how much hope do you have?
Can I just reflect on the two issues that was raised previously? One on the CDM. I agree with what has been said, that we need to look into the regulation, the modalities of the CDM, and I really hope that this will be done in Copenhagen to make sure that Africa can benefit from the CDM, so that it's not just Asia benefiting from the clean development mechanism. We have to do this better. And then I would also like to reflect on what was said about women being the most vulnerable, also in relation to climate change. I fully agree with this, and I've taken an initiative together with my Nordic colleagues to make sure that the issue of women and climate change is being dealt with in Copenhagen, just to mention this. So where are we right now? I mean, in overall terms, the negotiations, they are on track. And as I was saying in the very beginning, we from the Danish government side are really doing our utmost to make sure that we will have the setup to agree in Copenhagen, and hopefully agreeing on an ambitious agreement. things are going on in Bonn, and I understand that one of the major issues being discussed in Bonn is what we also touched a little bit upon here, and that was actually your first question raised to me, namely financing. Where should all the money come from? And this issue, I don't think this will be, I mean, this will not be settled until maybe just right before Copenhagen, or maybe even in Copenhagen. So I cannot, I mean, come any closer to that. Just saying that we, from the Danish government side, we are ready to do our utmost, and of course also with our development assistance, we are ready to do whatever we can to make sure that others are following suit. So the money will hopefully be there. As you might know, the Council of Ministers in the EU has a decision saying that there is a need for new and additional funding. But so far, no funding has been put on the table yet. But I really hope that when we are reaching or coming closer to Copenhagen, it will be more concrete.
Maybe with time that'll happen. Our clock is, one of the 3 clocks has run out. We still got our doomsday clock running. We got our Copenhagen clock that's running, less than 200 days away. We heard some hope from various, very briefly, because we're run out of time. Buyelwa.
I actually wanted to respond to my good lady there who was asking a question about the involvement of women. I think I must confess that we have not done very well. What is encouraging, the declaration, the Nairobi Declaration, which will be the tool that we'll be using for negotiations, does contain a provision for women. But I think even here in South Africa, I don't think we've done very, very well. I agree with Ulla that we need to begin to look at women in climate change and climate change as, you know, as an issue that needs to be given focus. Given the vulnerability of women, women are on the cold face, the majority of them, they are on the cold face of poverty. And as a consequence, they would be more vulnerable to vagaries of climate change. So I fully agree with you that something needs to be done there. Probably it has to start with us in Africa. We have to begin to grapple with that debate, which more often than not really is not given the importance that it deserves. So I fully agree with you on the point that you've raised. Well, the issue on forestry, it's a point well taken, and I appreciate that one. Enforcement of the law. Somebody was raising an issue about enforcing the law when it comes to the destruction of the forests. The issue is just that. The capacity for us to enforce the law is wanting. South Africa has begun to establish what we're calling the green scorpions, and hopefully they will help us then deal with those problems. But probably to also look at what we are saying, maybe we need to look at a carrot and stick approach. Where then you will engage people in programs that will have some incentive. And then in that way you will encourage them to help protect the forests as we have indicated.
And Buyelwa, you had the last word. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming. And at this point we see that there's creative chemistry here, and there's the political and the commercial will. Let's hope that pans out in Copenhagen. Thanks for coming.
Good.